Hi knitters! I'm Irina Rivo, thank you for joining me. This video is about how you can knit this scarf. It was made about 4 years ago. The design is unisex and timeless. It is long enough to wear over the shoulder, or you can wrap it around your neck on windy days. The pattern begins with a beautiful Italian cast-on edge and a little bit of ribbing. The main part is in a very easy-to-do garter stitch with symmetrical garter selvages on both sides. And it ends with matching ribbing and a bind-off technique that matches the Italian cast-on. This is the yarn that I used. It's Lamb's Pride, worsted weight, 85% wool, 15% mohair, 113 grams in 173 meters. My scarf weighs 472 grams. I used a little more than 4 balls of yarn. And throughout the whole project, for both ribbing and the main part, I used one needle size, 5 mm or US 8. And I cast on 49 stitches. The scarf is 25.5 centimeters or 10 inches wide and 227 centimeters or 89.5 inches long. In this tutorial, I'll demonstrate the scarf step by step. We'll begin with the Italian cast-on, followed by ribbing, then we'll move on to the main section in garter stitch, and finally I'll show you how to create the matching ribbing and finish with the invisible ribbed bind-off. For this sample, I'll be using this cotton yarn. You can make the scarf with any type of yarn you prefer. To determine the right needle size for your chosen yarn, I recommend making a swatch in garter stitch. I will use one needle size for everything from start to finish, 3.5 mm or US 4. I'm casting on an odd number of stitches for symmetry. In my case, it's 17 stitches. Leave a little bit of a yarn tail and wrap my yarn around my needle 17 times to measure the length of yarn for casting on. Take it off the needle, and this is where the first stitch is going to be. Now I place this loop over my left hand, my index finger under the working yarn, and my thumb goes under the yarn tail. The first stitch will be a purl stitch. I place my needle over the loop, under the working yarn, and turn. Next stitch is a knit stitch, under the tail, over the working yarn, and turn. Purl stitch, under the working yarn, over the tail, and turn. Knit stitch, under the tail, over the working yarn, and turn. And knit stitches look like a horseshoe. Again, purl stitch, under the working yarn, over the tail, and purl stitches look like they have a bump. I continue, knit stitch under the tail, over the working yarn, and turn. And the stitches look like they're paired together. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. They're easy to count. Again, purl stitch under the working yarn, over the tail, knit stitch under the tail, over the working yarn, purl stitch under the working yarn over the tail, knit stitch under the tail over the working yarn, purl stitch under the working yarn over the tail, knit stitch under the tail over the working yarn, purl stitch under the working yarn over the tail, and this is the last stitch. It's a purl stitch for symmetry. So I started and finished with a purl stitch. Now I continue holding my work and turn it counterclockwise, like this. And it's very important to hold the last stitches to secure them. And I'm going to change my hand. Now my working yarn is behind work. I continue holding the last stitches of my cast on row to secure them, and the yarn tail is in front. I take my right hand needle tip, I wrap the yarn tail around my ring finger, and here the first stitch is a knit stitch, but it's in an unusual position, it's facing right. So I'm going through the front of the stitch and slip it off like this. Next stitch is a regular purl stitch, and I purl it as usual. And now the work is secure, I can release the yarn tail. So in the first row only, all knit stitches are facing right. So I'm going to work them from right to left or through the front of the stitches to avoid twisting them. And all the purl stitches are positioned as usual, so they're facing left, and I purl them as usual from right to left. Again, knit stitch from right to left through the front of the stitch in the first row only, and purl stitch as usual. Knit stitch from right to left, and purl stitch as usual. Knit stitch from right to left, purl stitch as usual. Knit stitch from right to left, purl stitch as usual. And I made an exception for the last stitch. I will work it twisted from left to right to make a straight corner. So from left to right, like this. And that's it. We finished the first row of ribbing. Now I turn my work around. And I will begin the second row of ribbing. And if we take a look, the ribbing starts and ends with a purl stitch, so it's going to be symmetrical. I bring the stitches closer to the tip, and the first purl stitch I will slip. I move the needle under the working yarn, through the purl stitch, take it off, and under the working yarn like this. In this row of ribbing, all the stitches are facing left, and I work them as usual. So I will work the regular ribbing. Knit stitch from left to right as usual, through the front of the stitch, and purl stitch from right to left as usual through the back of the stitch. Again, knit stitch as usual, and purl stitch as usual. Keep my stitches closer to the tip, and continue the ribbing. Regular knit stitch, regular purl stitch, regular knit stitch, and regular purl stitch. And we finished the second row of ribbing. Now I turn the work around, and we're going to start the main part of the scarf in garter stitch. Yarn tail in front for convenience, and working yarn behind work like this. The first stitch will slip off as a knit stitch from left to right, and continue working only knit stitches. These are regular knit stitches all the way until the end of the row. Last two regular knit stitches. I'm just making sure that I don't split the yarn. And we finished the first row of the garter section. To continue the garter, we repeat the same. Turn the work around, working yarn is always behind work like this, under the needle tip. And the first stitch will always slip off from left to right as a knit stitch, and continue only knit stitches until the end of each row. Last two knit stitches, and we finished the second row of the garter section. To continue working in garter stitch, we always repeat the same steps. Working yarn is behind work, under the needle tip. The first stitch we slip off from left to right or through the front of the stitch, and work all the stitches as regular knit stitches until the end of each row. And we can continue working in garter stitch until we're happy with the length of the scarf. If you have a limited amount of yarn, you can knit in garter stitch until you have just enough yarn left for the final ribbing and the bind off that will match the ribbing and bind off at the beginning. In total, you will need to reserve about 10.5 times the width of the scarf. Now I'm going to start ribbing here, and I'm going to make it symmetrical with the ribbing at the beginning. So to follow my example, make sure that your working yarn is on the right and the yarn tail is also on the right. That's the easy way to follow me. Here I have a knit stitch, purl stitch, knit stitch, and so on. And I'm going to do the same here. Knit stitch, purl stitch, and so on. My working yarn is behind work, and I slip off the first stitch as a knit stitch. The following stitch is a purl stitch. Then again a knit stitch, purl stitch, knit stitch, and I'm finishing the row, purl stitch, and the last stitch is a knit stitch. This was the first row of ribbing. Turn the work around. Working yarn is in front. The first stitch is a purl stitch. And I slip it off from right to left. And I continue the ribbing. Knit stitch, purl stitch, knit stitch, purl stitch, and the last two stitches, knit stitch and purl stitch. And now we've completed 2 rows of ribbing. For binding off, I need to reserve about 4.5 times the width of the scarf. So that's 4 and a half. And now I can cut the yarn. And I'll be using a tapestry needle. Here is the essential rule for the invisible rib bind off. Once you learn it, you can apply it anytime without needing to watch tutorials. Each stitch is worked always twice. Knit stitch first time back to front of the stitch and second time front to back of the stitch. And purl stitches are always first time front to back of the stitch and second time back to front of the stitch. To make it easier for you to see what I'm doing, I switched from a steel circular to a short bamboo needle. It's much more compact to work in front of the camera and there is a better contrast. So the first stitch here is a knit stitch. And I'm working it first time. I'm inserting the tapestry needle back to front of the stitch. Pull the yarn tail through and slip the stitch off the needle and slightly pull the yarn tail. The following stitch is a purl stitch and I'm working it first time front to back of the stitch. pull the yarn tail through and slip it off. And make sure that you do not tighten the yarn tail. Now I'm returning to the first knit stitch. I'm going to work it second time, front to back of the stitch. And I'm going into the next knit stitch, first time back to front of the stitch. And pull the yarn tail through. And here the first stitch, I just pay attention and make sure that it looks upright. Slip the knit stitch off the needle. Everything looks good. It looks like a nice straight column. And I continue. I just bound off 2 knit stitches. And now I'm going to do 2 purl stitches. Purl stitches at the back look like knit stitch columns. So I go back to front of the purl stitch and front to back of the next purl stitch. And pull the yarn tail through. Again, making sure I do not tighten it too much. Leave it a little bit on the looser side. Now again, I am working 2 knit stitches. Second time into this knit stitch, front to back of the stitch. And first time into the next knit stitch, back to front of the stitch. And slip it off. Next, 2 purl stitches. Again, they look like knit stitch columns at the back. So this purl stitch second time back to front. And the following purl stitch first time front to back. And slip it off. Again, 2 knit stitches. This one second time front to back, and the other one first time back to front. And slip it off. 2 purl stitches. They look like 2 knit stitch columns at the back. This one second time back to front. And this one first time front to back. And slip it off. Make sure it's not too tight so that the columns look upright. And again, 2 knit stitches. This one is going to be worked second time, so it's front to back, and the other one first time back to front. Two purl stitches. Second time back to front, and first time front to back. 2 knit stitches, this one second time, so it's front to back, and this one first time back to front. This is the last stitch. So I'm going to find the purl stitch at the back. I'm going to work it second time, so it's back to front. And this last stitch was a knit stitch, so working it second time is front to back. And that's it. The bind off is finished, and it's absolutely symmetrical on both ends. Now we need to weave in the yarn tails, and I generally prefer, whenever possible, to split the yarn into 2 strands. So they will be way less noticeable if you weave them in separately. I have a full video of how to weave it in when you work with garter stitch, so I invite you to watch that video. Here I'll just show you the first steps, how you would move away from the ribbing up, and then you can continue weaving it in, outlining the stitches. So I'm moving it up a couple of rows, something like this. And now I can go around this stitch and just follow the way the yarn is woven into these stitches. So there you go. We made a miniature scarf. You can make it as wide and as long as you like. And you can use any yarn you like. Just make a swatch in garter stitch to see what needle size works best. Thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a thumbs up if you find it helpful and to support the channel. Happy knitting, and I'll see you in the next one.